Usually when we talk about power, we picture something really tangible, something heavy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We have this, like, deeply ingrained bias to associate power with physical mass.
Right, like a vault full of gold bars or a massive concrete dam holding back a river or, fleet of fighter jets parked on a tarmac.
Exactly. Things that have undeniable, measurable weight. Things that physically cast a shadow.
It's visceral. But then you zoom out and you look at the actual architecture of human society, and suddenly you realize that the most powerful forces on Earth, well, they weigh absolutely nothing.
Yeah, they don't cast a shadow at all. They are entirely invisible, which is a deeply unsettling realization once you truly internalize it. I mean, we are basically ruled by phantoms.
And that invisible architecture is exactly what we are decoding today. Welcome to our deep dive into the source material. We're looking at a fascinating document titled O3 Stories, UnlimitedConnections.pdf.
It really is an incredible text.
It is. So our mission today is to pull back the curtain on this hidden scaffolding. We're going to explore exactly why our specific species rules the planet, how we quite literally use fictional stories to hack our own biology, and this is the scary part, the dangerous tightrope walk we are all on between seeking the truth and maintaining social order.
And I would argue that tightrope walk is the defining crisis of our modern era. We are currently just drowning in information.
Oh, completely drowning.
Right. But the fundamental problem is that we completely misunderstand what information actually does. We operate on this naive assumption that information is just a flashlight.
Like it just illuminates objective facts.
Exactly. But looking at the historical and sociological record, information doesn't just reveal the world, it actively constructs it. It is the invisible glue that binds millions of strangers together, or, the wedge that tears them apart.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I understand why we are the way we are, we have to start with a biological bottleneck, a hard limit.
Right, the biology problem.
Yeah, if you look at the dominance of Homo sapiens, it comes down to one very specific, very freakish superpower. We are the only animals on the planet that can cooperate flexibly in massive numbers.
The contrast with other social animals is what makes this so stark. I mean, think about ants or bees.
Right, they have huge numbers.
Huge. An ant colony is a marvel of massive cooperation. You can have millions of individuals working in perfect, staggering synchronization. They farm fungus. They build intricate ventilation systems.
It literally wage war.
They wage war. But their cooperation is entirely rigid. It's totally inflexible. It is dictated completely by their genetics and chemical pheromones.
Right, like an ant worker can't suddenly have a philosophical awakening, decide her labor's being exploited, overthrow the queen, and establish a communist utopia.
Exactly. Their social structure is biologically hardwired. They can't decide to negotiate a complex trade treaty with the neighboring colony, to exchange aphid nectar for territory. They just run the biological code they were born with.
So ants have the numbers, but not the flexibility.
Right. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, look at chimpanzees, our closest evolutionary relatives. Chimpanzees possess intense social flexibility.
They're super political.
Incredibly political. They form fluid coalitions. They engage in brutal, calculating political maneuvers to overthrow an alpha male. They can adapt to new social realities. But their flexibility is capped by a severe numbers problem.
The intimacy cap.
Precisely. Chimpanzee communities usually top out at around 20 to 60 individuals. If you get an unusually abundant food source, maybe you see a supergroup of up to 150, but that is the absolute hard ceiling.
And why is that the limit?
The reason for that ceiling is the physical mechanism they use to build trust. For a chimpanzee to trust another chimpanzee enough to share food or watch their back in a fight, they have to know them intimately.
And chimpanzee trust is built through physical grooming, right? Like picking bugs out of fur.
Yes, exactly. It's an incredibly time-consuming, metabolically expensive process. They sit together for hours, picking through each other's fur, releasing endorphins. It establishes a physical debt and a personal bond.
But there are only so many hours in a day.
Right. You physically cannot groom 1,000 individuals.
It's a chimp-to-chimp chain. You can only know so many individuals before your brain just runs out of processing power to track the social web. Now, who likes who owes who a favor, who stole whose food last Tuesday.
And the crucial thing to understand is that this was exactly the biological limit that early humans faced. For millions of years, ancient human species, including the Neanderthals and even early Homo sapiens, lived in those same small, isolated bands.
That's a few dozen individuals.
Yeah. Different bands rarely cooperated. In fact, they often violently clashed. If we had relied strictly on those personal human-to-human bonds, our networks today would be no larger than those of the Neanderthals.
We would still be living in isolated tribes of 50 people, hunting and foraging. Which brings us to the ultimate workaround. I mean, the greatest hack in the history of biology. Imagine your brain is a smartphone,
Okay, I like this analogy.
and you only have enough RAM, right? Enough working memory to hold the faces, personalities, and behavioral quirks of about 150 people. That's your biological hardware limit.
Often called Dunbar's number in sociology.
Right. But then, roughly 70,000 years ago, during the cognitive revolution, something incredible happened.
Yeah.
Evolutionary changes in our brain structure and linguistic abilities effectively gave us a new operating system. We developed the aptitude to tell, believe, and be deeply moved by fictional stories.
And that is the pivotal leap that changes the trajectory of the planet. Because stories act like the ultimate cloud-based server.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Instead of building a network purely out of one-to-one, human-to-human chains, we invented human-to-story chains.
So you no longer have to spend 5 years getting to know someone, grooming them, sharing food with them, just to trust them. You just have to know that they believe the same story you do.
What's fascinating here is the sheer unlimited scale this unlocks. Once you shift from human-to-human trust to human-to-story trust, the upper limit just vanishes.
It's gone.
Completely gone. You have the Catholic Church connecting roughly 1.4 billion members. You have the nation-state of China connecting 1.4 billion citizens. And you have the global capitalist trade network connecting essentially 8 billion sapiens.
Yeah, I have absolutely no idea who grew the coffee beans I drank this morning.
Right. You don't know the factory worker who assembled the battery in your microphone either, but you cooperate with them seamlessly across vast oceans because you all believe in the story of the dollar, the euro, the corporate brand, and the legal contract.
It's mind-blowing when you really sit with it. A story becomes this central hub. But let's bring this down to earth, because it's easy to hear the word story and immediately picture like fairy tales or myths or campfire legends.
Right. It feels too abstract.
Exactly. How do these stories actually manifest in the gritty, physical world we interact with every single day? It's not just religious concepts. It's the leaders we follow and the physical products we consume.
It fundamentally is. The illusion of the leader is one of the most powerful examples of this. We tend to think that when we follow a charismatic figure, whether that's an ancient emperor, a medieval pope, or a modern tech CEO, we are connecting to a flesh and blood human being.
But mathematically, physically, we aren't.
Almost none of the millions of followers will ever have an authentic two-way personal bond with that leader.
Wait, so what are millions of people actually pledging their loyalty to, if not the person?
They are connecting to a carefully crafted story about the leader. It's the narrative avatar they put their faith in, not the actual sweating, flawed biological organism. There is a brilliant historical anecdote involving Joseph Stalin from the text that perfectly illustrates this dynamic.
I love this story. It's such a surreal peek behind the curtain of absolute power.
It really is. So Stalin was at the center of one of the most omnipresent personality cults in human history. His face was on every building. His name was invoked in every public speech. But Stalin himself, the biological man, understood exactly the mechanics of this fiction.
He knew it was a brand.
He absolutely knew. During World War II, his son, Vasily, was causing all sorts of trouble. He was throwing his weight around, getting drunk, using the famous Stalin name to frighten officers and avoid discipline. Joseph Stalin found out and was just furious. He confronted Vasily and berated him.
And Vasily, being the arrogant son of a dictator, pushes back. He basically says, "Why are you yelling at me? I'm a Stalin too."
Yes. And Joseph Stalin's reply is chillingly insightful. He doesn't say, "Hey, I'm the boss." He tells his son, "No, you're not. You're not Stalin and I'm not Stalin. Stalin is Soviet power. Stalin is what he is in the newspapers and the portraits, not you. Not even me."
Not even me. The actual physical man named Joseph Stalin is openly acknowledging that the entity called Stalin, the thing that millions of people worship, the thing that millions of people are terrified of, is a total fiction.
Right. He's admitting that he is essentially a captive of his own PR campaign. He is just the biological host for the intersubjective story living in the newspapers.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is the exact same underlying mechanism used by modern influencers, politicians, and celebrities today.
Oh, absolutely. They might have 100 million followers who feel this deep, intimate, daily connection with them through their screens. but there is rarely an authentic relationship there.
Those accounts are run by teams of experts. Every spontaneous-looking photo, every candid caption, every vulnerable video is professionally curated to manufacture what we now call a brand.
A brand is really just a highly weaponized, highly monetized story.
Which brings us perfectly to the branding of physical products. Think about Coca-Cola. For over a century, the Coca-Cola Corporation has spent tens of billions of dollars doing exactly one thing.
Telling and retelling a specific story about a specific beverage.
Right. They've relentlessly hammered this narrative into the global consciousness so thoroughly that billions of people associate a mixture of flavored water, high fructose corn syrup, and carbonation with youth and happiness and summer fun.
Rather than, as a strictly objective biologist might point out, tooth decay, metabolic dysfunction, and plastic waste.
Exactly. The physical, objective reality of the liquid in the can is just colored syrup. The brand is the psychological wrapper that makes you feel a certain way when you drink it. But okay, branding a soda makes sense. Branding a ruthless dictator makes sense. But then we have the case of Cherami, the branding of a literal pigeon.
This is a remarkable case study in how a compelling story can completely overwrite physical, historical facts.
For context for you listening, Cherami was famously known as the heroic pigeon of World War I. The popular narrative was incredibly dramatic.
Right. This brave bird, despite being shot through the breast, blinded in one eye, and having a leg hanging by a tendon, managed to deliver a critical message that saved the lost battalion of American soldiers from friendly artillery fire.
It was a massive, heartwarming narrative of sacrifice. The winged savior of the Argonne Forest. It's the kind of story they make movies out of.
It really is.
But then historian Frank Blazich published a revisionist study in 2021, and the details are just staggering.
Blazich went back to the original contemporary military records and the physical evidence, and he found that the entire foundation of the story is deeply flawed.
How so?
Well, first of all, the timeline doesn't match the myth. Headquarters already knew the exact location of the lost battalion about 20 minutes before the pigeon ever arrived. The message didn't actually stop the friendly fire. The artillery had already been adjusting.
But hang on. Blazich's study might debunk some of the dramatic timing, but the bird still flew through enemy fire, right? Isn't it a bit cynical to call the whole thing a PR campaign just because the military embellished the timeline a little bit to make it sound better?
That's a fair question, but it goes much deeper than embellishment. Blazich found there is simply no definitive proof that the specific pigeon carrying that specific message was even Cherami.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It might have been a completely different, undocumented bird. Furthermore, the record suggests Cherami might have gotten those famous, gruesome wounds weeks later in a completely different sector of the war.
Wait, so the military just took a wounded bird, slapped a name on it, and attached it to a battle it might not have even flown in? Our historical animal heroes are essentially manufactured mascots.
What's fascinating here is why the story survived and grew to such proportions despite the facts. You have to look at the context. It's the end of World War I. Millions are dead. The public is traumatized.
They needed to win.
Exactly. The U.S. Army's Pigeon Service desperately needed good PR to justify its funding and existence. The propaganda value of this heroic bird and the emotional appeal to a grieving public completely outweighed the mundane truth.
The story was so psychologically satisfying that people just couldn't resist it.
And so it grew in the telling. Journalists, filmmakers, and poets started adding fictional details.
It became a phenomenon. The bird was awarded the French Croix de Guerre. It became the most famous animal in the world in the 1920s. And when it died, they stuffed it and put it on display in the Smithsonian.
And this is where it gets really wild.
Yeah, this is the part of the phenomenon that really shook me. There was a man named Sherman Eager. He was an actual officer in the Lost Battalion. He was physically there in the mud, being shelled.
So he lived the objective reality of the battle.
Right. But decades later, he brings his kids to the Smithsonian, points to this stuffed pigeon behind the glass, and says, "You all owe your lives to that pigeon."
It perfectly demonstrates the overwhelming, terrifying power of a shared narrative. Even the memories of the people who lived through the objective, physical reality of the battle were eventually taken over and rewritten by the intersubjective story.
His own lived experience couldn't compete with the brand.
The narrative was simply too powerful, too culturally ubiquitous to let his own lived experience get in the way. He adopted the cultural myth as his personal memory.
If a story can rewrite the lived memory of a combat veteran, what can it do to the fundamental building blocks of human society? What happens when a story targets the deepest biological instinct we have, the concept of family?
That's the next logical step.
We talked earlier about how chimpanzees are strictly limited to their biological family and their immediate, physically groomed acquaintances. But humans somehow figured out how to forge massive global families out of thin air.
And they did this by hijacking pre-existing biological bonds. The feeling of family, the maternal or paternal instinct, the loyalty to a sibling. These are the strongest evolutionary bonds mammals have.
Right.
What humans did was use stories to stretch those intimate biological feelings across millions of complete strangers. To understand this, we can look at how religious narratives function purely as sociological network-building tools.
Right, and looking at this strictly through the lens of historical network dynamics, let's look at the evolution of early Christianity. The text makes a sharp distinction between the historical person of Jesus and the story of Jesus.
Yes. From a purely historical, objective standpoint, based on the physical evidence in contemporary Roman records, the real person of Jesus was a Jewish preacher living in a minor, dusty Roman province.
He traveled on foot.
He gathered a small, localized following, preached, and was ultimately executed by the state. In his actual physical lifetime, he impacted maybe a few thousand people in a very restricted geographic area.
But the story of Jesus, that became a completely different entity entirely.
Exactly. After his death, we see the beginning of what is arguably the most successful and enduring branding campaign in human history. Over 2 millennia, layers upon layers of storytelling, theology, and philosophy encased the historical figure.
He was rebranded from a local preacher into the physical incarnation of the cosmic deity who created the universe.
And while the physical person was limited to walking between villages in the Levant, the story of Jesus was frictionless. It flew. It traveled on Roman roads via gossip, then on parchment in monasteries, then through Renaissance paintings and towering cathedrals, and today it travels through television broadcasts and internet memes.
And it's really important to emphasize that this wasn't some cynical, deliberate deception. It wasn't ancient disinformation cooked up in a boardroom.
No, absolutely not. It's crucial to understand the psychology here. Figures like St. Paul or Martin Luther weren't scheming to trick people to gain power. They were true believers.
They genuinely felt it.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were projecting their deeply felt hopes, their existential fears, and their profound emotions onto the narrative of Jesus. It's the exact same psychological mechanism we use when we project feelings onto a romantic partner, elevating them in our minds.
Right.
History's most powerful stories are almost always the result of emotional projections and desperate wishful thinking by people who genuinely believe every word they're saying.
And because billions of people became true believers, that story created an incredibly robust network. It allowed 2 complete strangers, say, a farmer in medieval France and a merchant in medieval Ethiopia, to look at each other and instantly identify as brothers in Christ.
It stretched the biological family bond to cover vast swaths of the globe.
And crucially, it provided those strangers with a shared pool of family memories. Most Christians today obviously weren't physically present at the Last Supper, but because of the relentless repetition of the story, the rituals, and the iconography, they remember the emotional weight of that event more vividly than they remember actual dinners they had with their own biological families last year.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The Last Supper was actually a celebration of the Jewish Passover meal.
Yes.
And the Passover meal itself is quite literally an ancient technology designed specifically to hack human memory and forge these exact types of bonds.
It is one of the most brilliantly effective social mechanisms ever devised. In Jewish tradition, the Passover meal, the Seder, isn't just a dry historical recitation of facts. Its explicitly stated purpose is to create and implant artificial memories.
Exactly. When Jewish families sit down on the eve of Passover, they are interacting with a text called the Haggadah, and the Haggadah obligates them to regard themselves as if they personally had escaped from slavery in Egypt.
The text literally says, in every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself as if he personally had come out of Egypt. You aren't just supposed to raise a glass and say, wow, our ancestors had it really tough back then.
No, you are supposed to physically and emotionally immerse yourself. You eat bitter herbs to taste the bitterness of slavery. You eat matzah to experience the rushed flight into the desert.
You are supposed to feel the sand between your own toes, feel the sting of the whip on your own back, and see the Red Sea part with your own eyes.
And if a skeptical person sitting at the table objects and says, well, objectively, physically, I wasn't there. I was born in Brooklyn in 1990.
The tradition has a built-in theological answer.
Right. The sages claim that the souls of all Jews throughout history were created long before their physical bodies were born, and all those souls were literally present at Mount Sinai to receive the commandments.
There's a quote in the text from Salvador Litvak, a modern influencer, who said, "We don't imagine the Exodus, we remember it." It's like the entire community is plugging in to download a shared cultural software update.
And the neuroscience actually backs up how effective this is. Modern psychological studies consistently show that if you repeatedly retell a fake memory, especially if you attach strong sensory details and emotional weight to it, a person's brain will eventually adopt it as a genuine recollection.
The neural pathways literally rewire to accommodate the story.
Think about the immense practical power of that. When two Jewish strangers meet for the first time, one from Argentina and one from Yemen, they don't just share a demographic category on a census form. They share a deeply implanted, visceral, emotional memory of suffering together as slaves under Pharaoh and standing together in awe at Mount Sinai.
That is a bond strong enough to sustain a decentralized network across centuries of persecution and across multiple continents.
It's incredible.
Okay, so we've seen how stories can rewrite the memory of a soldier and how they can stretch family bonds across millions of strangers. But now we have to tackle what I think is the most massive conceptual leap in this entire exploration.
The three dimensions of reality.
Yes, stories didn't just build networks. They quite literally birthed a completely new dimension of reality itself.
This is a profound philosophical framework, but it has immediate, everyday, practical implications. Before the cognitive revolution, before storytelling emerged, the universe essentially operated on only two levels of reality: objective and subjective.
Let's clearly define those boundaries. Objective reality, what is it?
Objective reality consists of things that exist entirely independently of human awareness, belief, or feeling. Stones, mountains, rivers, asteroids, radiation.
If a massive asteroid is hurtling toward Earth, it exists whether anyone on Earth has seen it in a telescope or not.
Exactly. Its existence doesn't depend on our belief. If
Yeah.
you stop believing in gravity, you will still fall off the cliff.
Right. The universe doesn't care about your feelings. And subjective reality.
Subjective reality consists of things that exist only within the private theater of a single mind. Pain, pleasure, joy, fear. They aren't physical objects floating out in the world. They are internal experiences.
An unfelt ache is a biological oxymoron. If you stop feeling the pain ceases to exist. It requires your conscious experience to be real.
Exactly. So we have the hard physical world out there and the internal emotional world in here. But then humans invent complex language. We invent stories, and these stories birth the third level of reality, intersubjective reality.
Intersubjective reality exists in the nexus between millions of minds. It exists purely in the communication, the exchange of information, the shared web of belief that people weave together.
Laws, gods, nations, corporations, currencies, human rights.
None of these things exist in the objective physical world. You cannot point to a physical object that is human rights.
Nor do they exist solely in one person's subjective mind. They exist because, and only because, a massive group of people collectively agree to believe the same story.
And if everyone suddenly stopped believing the story or forgot about it, the intersubjective entity would instantly vanish into thin air. Let's use the pizza and Bitcoin example because I think it beautifully illustrates the friction between objective and intersubjective reality.
It's a perfect illustration of how crazy our world has become. In 2010, a programmer named Laszlo Hanyecz famously bought 2 Papa John's pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoins. At the time, it was the first known commercial transaction using the cryptocurrency.
Right. At the time, Bitcoin was just a fun, highly niche internet experiment. Those 10,000 Bitcoins were worth maybe $40.
Exactly. But fast forward to November 2021, the value of a single Bitcoin hit over $69,000, which meant the 10,000 Bitcoins he paid for those 2 pizzas were suddenly, intersubjectively, worth $690 million.
The most expensive late-night snack in the history of the universe.
By far.
But think about the mechanics of what actually happened here. The caloric value of those pizzas is an objective reality. A typical large pizza has maybe 2,000 calories. That objective, physical, biological fact did not change one bit between 2010 and 2021. A pizza is a pizza.
But the financial value of the Bitcoin is entirely an intersubjective reality. It exploded from the price of a cheap dinner to $690 million strictly and entirely because of the stories people told and the collective belief they invested into the network.
There is no objective physical change in a Bitcoin. You can't hold it, you can't eat it. It's just cryptographic code on a distributed ledger.
The value is purely generated by a consensus algorithm of human belief. Fiat currency, like the US dollar, works the exact same way. It's paper and ink, or digital numbers on a bank server, infused with the intersubjective story of the full faith and credit of the US government.
It's just astonishing. The physical world stays stubbornly the same, but the intersubjective world can mutate wildly overnight based on panic or hype or trust. And this exact same logic applies to the existence of nations. Let's look at the comparison between nation-states and the Loch Ness Monster.
This is a fantastic thought experiment for testing reality. If you ask the question, does the Loch Ness Monster exist, you are asking a question about objective biological reality.
You can go to Scotland, you can deploy scientific instruments, you can do deep water sonar scans of the loch.
You can take wadi samples and run environmental DNA sequencing. And scientists have actually done this. In 2019, a major DNA survey analyzed the loch and found genetic material from over 3,000 species. They found a lot of eel DNA. They found zero monster DNA.
So objectively, physically, it doesn't exist.
And even if there's a guy sitting in a pub in Inverness who really subjectively believes with all his heart that the monster is real, his intense subjective belief doesn't magically spawn a physical plesiosaur in the lake. Objective reality simply doesn't care about his feelings.
Precisely. But now contrast that with a nation-state. States are entirely intersubjective entities. You cannot use a sonar scan or a DNA test to prove that the United States or China or France exists.
You can't put France in a test tube, the physical land exists, the people exist, but the nation is a conceptual overlay.
We take their existence for granted because the story is so deeply embedded. But you can see the invisible seams of this reality clearly when the story is contested. The geopolitical stage is full of examples where the intersubjective status of a state is fiercely debated.
And again, keeping this strictly to the geopolitical mechanics of recognition, look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Fundamentally, underneath the physical violence, this is a clash over intersubjective reality. As of 2024, countries like Brazil and China recognize the story that both Israel and Palestine exist as states. The United States and Cameroon legally recognize that only Israel exists. Algeria and Iran legally recognize that only Palestine exists.
And it's not just the Middle East. Look at Kosovo. About half the United Nations believes the story that Kosovo is an independent nation, while the other half believes the story that it's a province of Serbia.
Abkhazia is seen by most of the world as part of Georgia, but Russia and a handful of other countries say it's an independent state.
Even the United States went through this exact intersubjective limbo between declaring independence in 1776 and signing the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The existence of the U.S. was heavily contested.
George Washington and the Continental Congress passionately believed the story that the U.S. existed. King George III aggressively rejected that story, claiming they were just rebellious British subjects.
You couldn't run a DNA test on the soil of Virginia to see who was right. The United States only truly existed once enough people, and crucially, enough other powerful countries, agreed to believe the story and sign legally binding intersubjective agreements with it.
It really makes you realize how fragile our daily lives are. We live almost entirely inside this third dimension.
If you take a billionaire, this is an analogy that really drives it home for me. If a billionaire's private jet crashes on a desert island and he manages to swim to shore with a waterproof suitcase stuffed with $100 million in bearer bonds and cash,
he's completely powerless.
completely impotent, because he has forcefully stepped outside the intersubjective information network.
Right. He can't wave a stack of crisp $100 bills at a monkey and expect the monkey to fetch him coconuts or build him a raft.
The monkey only lives in objective reality. To the monkey, the $100 bill is just a piece of paper with a weird smell that isn't edible. Intersubjective power only works inside the network of believers.
The moment you step outside the network, you are just a naked ape on a rock.
Which brings us to a really critical evolutionary question. If this intersubjective world is entirely made up, why did evolution favor it so heavily? Why did the ability to spin these complex fictional webs give early sapiens such a massive, undeniable survival advantage over other human species?
It comes down to a brutal prehistoric math problem. Picture a conflict, 500 sapiens versus 50 Neanderthals.
The Neanderthals were objectively stronger. They had larger brains, thicker bones, more muscle mass.
But because they were limited to human intimacy networks, they lived in isolated bands of maybe a few dozen. They couldn't cooperate across different bands.
But the sapiens, armed with the power of stories, could link multiple small bands into a massive cohesive tribe of hundreds or thousands.
Right. They were connected by shared intersubjective realities. Maybe they revered the same ancestral spirits or shared a belief in a totem animal. So, in a direct, violent conflict over a hunting ground, 500 organized sapiens will easily overwhelm 50 uncoordinated Neanderthals, regardless of individual physical strength.
But it wasn't just about warfare and violence. It was about economics. It was an ancient, decentralized insurance policy.
Exactly. Let's say your band of 50 sapiens faces a terrible localized drought. Your watering holes dry up, the game moves on.
If you are isolated, like the Neanderthals, you simply starve to death. But if you share a story, say a deeply held belief in the Great Bear spirit, with another band 3 valleys over, you can migrate there. You can essentially knock on their cave and say, hey, we are brothers of the Great Bear, and because they believe the same fiction, they will take you in.
They'll share their food, teach you the local dangers, and intermarry.
And you share technology. If one band figures out a new, highly effective way to chip flint for spearheads, or discovers a local plant that cures infections, that crucial information spreads rapidly across the entire tribal network via the shared language and shared trust.
An individual sapien might not have been any smarter than an individual Neanderthal, but a network of 500 sapiens is exponentially more intelligent, more adaptable, and more resilient than 50 isolated Neanderthals. The network is the organism.
And this incredible power of the intersubjective network leads us directly into a fascinating intellectual debate. It fundamentally challenges the Marxist interpretation of history.
Oh, this is a big one.
Yeah. Now, the materialist or Marxist view generally argues that all this story stuff, religion, nationalism, political ideals, human rights, is basically just a smokescreen. It's an illusion. They argue that all human conflict and social evolution is actually driven purely by objective material interests.
Yeah.
Food, land, natural resources, control of the means of production.
According to that materialist view, epic events like the Crusades or World War I or the 2003 Iraq War weren't truly about God or patriotism or bringing democracy to the Middle East. Those were just convenient myths.
Right. The real drivers were strictly elites fighting over economic interests, trade routes, territory, oil, and using those myths as ideological fig leaves to trick the masses into fighting and dying for them.
But looking at the historical record, this view is not only incredibly cynical, it's factually incomplete. It fails to answer a devastatingly simple question. If everything is strictly about objective material needs, how do you explain who teams up with who?
Exactly. If history is just a giant game of monopoly over wealth and land, why did French and German merchants in the 12th century unite, spend vast fortunes, and travel thousands of dangerous miles to conquer the Levant during the Crusades?
Geographically and economically, it would have made infinitely more sense for the French to unite with the North Africans to conquer Italy, which was right next door and overflowing with wealth.
Or take the Iraq War. If the U.S. and Britain just ruthlessly wanted to steal resources, why go after Iraq's oil in a hostile desert halfway across the world? Why not just invade Norway and take their massive gas fields?
The material interests, the oil, the land might be objective realities, but the identities of the rival camps, who constitutes us and who constitutes them, are entirely defined by the intersubjective stories.
If we connect this back to our biological cousins, it becomes undeniable. Chimpanzees have the exact same fundamental objective material needs that humans do.
They desperately need food, they need fresh water, they compete aggressively for sexual access, they vie for social dominance and territory.
But chimpanzees never form massive, continent-spanning armies. They never establish global religions or capitalist markets or nation-states to secure those resources.
Because they can't invent the story of chimpanzee nationalism. They can't rally around a shared identity of being the true chimps of the eastern forest.
Precisely. Contrary to strict Marxist thinking, large-scale human identities and collective interests are never purely objective. They're always fundamentally intersubjective constructs.
And the incredible thing is, this is actually incredibly good news for humanity. It's the ultimate silver lining.
It really is the entire basis for human hope. Think about the implications. If our conflicts were strictly and entirely driven by objective material scarcity, if it was just physics and biology dictating that there isn't enough food to go around, then the only way to resolve conflict would be through violence.
It would be a permanent, zero-sum fight to the death over a piece of meat or a patch of arable land.
But because our conflicts are largely based on intersubjective stories, well, we have a superpower. We can change the story.
We can talk, we can negotiate, we can invent new, broader stories that encompass everyone. We went from warring tribes to warring city-states to warring nations, and now we at least have the conceptual framework of a global human community.
We can rewrite the cultural software. Look at the tragic rise of Nazism in the 20th century. History is not just a deterministic, physics-driven clash of material forces.
Yes, the severe economic crisis and hyperinflation of the 1920s and 30s created terrible objective material conditions in Germany. People were starving. But the Third Reich was not the inevitable, mathematically guaranteed outcome of that crisis.
Germans in the early 1930s had choices. They had different stories on offer to explain their suffering and chart a path forward. They could have chosen communism. They could have chosen to strengthen the Weimar democracy.
But they made a tragic, catastrophic mistake. They chose to believe a mesmerizing, hateful, and biologically completely false story about racial purity and Aryan destiny.
And we know definitively it was a mistake because of the objective outcome. 12 years of believing that story led to the utter physical destruction of their country, the division of their nation, and the horrific deaths of millions.
When West Germany later adopted the story of liberal democracy and human rights, their objective material lives actually improved dramatically.
It highlights the profound, terrifying responsibility we have. History isn't just a tide of material forces washing over us. It's actively shaped by the fictions we choose to believe, empower, and enforce.
Which brings us to what I consider the most dangerous and relevant part of this entire exploration, the paradox of power.
The eternal tension between truth and order. There are two contrasting models of how information works in society, and understanding the difference is crucial.
The first model is what we can call the naive view. This is the comforting, almost fairy tale version of how we are taught the world works. In the naive view, information points directly to truth, and truth then branches off to give us wisdom and power.
Right. It's the classical Enlightenment idea that if you study hard, gather all the data, and learn the objective facts of the universe, you will become powerful.
And because you know the truth, you will naturally use that power wisely. It assumes that liars, charlatans, and people who ignore reality will ultimately fail because reality will eventually catch up with them.
We desperately want to believe that our CEOs, our presidents, our cultural leaders are at the top of the pyramid because they are the most truthful and wise among us.
But the historical record shatters this comforting illusion. The second model is the historical view of information. In the real, messy world of human sociology, information doesn't just point in a straight line to truth. Information splits into two distinct, often conflicting paths.
One path goes toward discovering truth, but the other path goes toward creating order.
And those two paths are constantly at war with each other.
Constantly. Because telling the absolute, unvarnished truth about a complicated, chaotic universe is almost never the most efficient way to organize millions of people into a cohesive society. Let's look at the Manhattan Project as a pristine example of this dynamic.
Oh, this is the perfect encapsulation. Building the atomic bomb required both paths, but in very different ways.
To build an atomic bomb, you absolutely non-negotiably need truth. You need brilliant physicists like Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi who deeply understand the objective reality of quantum mechanics and E equals mc squared.
If you try to build a nuclear reactor based on a fictional story or ideological wishful thinking, it simply won't work. The uranium won't split. Objective reality always wins in physics.
So truth gives you the raw, explosive power. But
Oppenheimer, sitting alone in a room with a chalkboard, cannot build an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was an organizational leviathan. It required 130,000 people working directly on the project and millions more supporting it indirectly.
it required building entire secret cities in Oak Ridge and Los Alamos.
It required miners pulling uranium out of the earth in freezing Canadian winters and the sweltering Belgian Congo. It required tens of thousands of potato farmers growing food to feed the miners, the construction workers, and the physicists. How do you get millions of diverse people to cooperate on that massive scale, especially when most of them don't even know what they are building?
You definitely don't do it by handing a potato farmer a complex differential equation. You do it with order. You do it with a powerful, unifying story about patriotism, about defending the free world, about defeating ultimate evil.
Exactly. Knowing that E equals mc squared doesn't inspire a miner to work a grueling, dangerous 16-hour shift. Fictional stories, national myths, ideological fervor, That's what holds the organizational network together.
And historically, we see a terrifying hierarchy emerge from this. The people who know how to build ideologies and maintain order almost always end up giving the instructions to the people who only know how to find truth.
Right. The order builders boss around the truth finders. Robert Oppenheimer, the master of truth, took his orders from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the master of political order.
Werner Heisenberg, the brilliant German physicist, took his orders from Adolf Hitler, a master of dark mythological order.
Because fiction enjoys two massive, unfair advantages over truth when it comes to uniting people. First, fiction can be incredibly simple and elegant.
Truth is almost always messy, nuanced, and complicated. It's really hard to stand in front of a massive crowd and inspire them by explaining the highly nuanced intersubjective nature of the modern nation-state and the complex trade-offs of macroeconomic policy.
It is much easier and much more emotionally effective to just yell, "God gave us this land and we have a glorious divine mission to conquer our enemies."
And the second advantage is that truth hurts. Truth is painful and offensive. No nation, no religion, no individual has a perfect, unblemished history.
If a politician gets up on a debate stage and accurately lists all the atrocities, blunders, and historical crimes their country has committed, they aren't going to win the election. They will be booed off the stage.
The politician who spins a beautiful, flattering fiction about a glorious, pure, heroic past, they will sweep into power.
This concept is incredibly old. We can trace it all the way back to ancient Greece, to Plato's Republic. Plato wrestled with this exact problem of how to maintain a stable society. He actually outlined a concept he called the noble lie.
He argued that to maintain social order, to justify the social hierarchy, and to prevent citizens from constantly rebelling, the state needs to deliberately feed them a foundational myth.
Yeah, his specific suggestion was wild. He suggested telling everyone from birth that they were literally born out of the earth of the motherland, making them fiercely territorial, and that the gods mixed different metals into their souls before birth.
Gold for the ruling class, silver for the warrior class, and bronze or iron for the working class. It's a completely fabricated pseudo-biological hierarchy designed to make everyone accept their lot in life without complaining. I can't be king, I only have bronze in my soul.
And while Plato's specific utopian state was never built, the fundamental strategy of the noble lie, the order-building myth, has been used by almost every major society in human history. The caste system in India, the divine right of kings in Europe, the mandate of heaven in China.
The danger, though, and this is a critical vulnerability for our future, is what happens when a society prioritizes order so heavily that it actively suppresses truth.
Ignorance is strength. That's the classic dystopian trap. If a society is built on a very fragile, very rigid, foundational myth, say, the literal belief that the physical world was created in exactly 6 24-hour days, then a scientist discovering the truth of Darwinian evolution or the geological age of the Earth becomes a direct existential threat to the social order.
They aren't just doing science, they are accidentally dismantling the glue that holds the society together. We see governments and religious institutions literally ban the teaching of certain scientific truths because they'd rather sacrifice reality to protect the order.
But you can't just ban all truth. If a society bans all scientific inquiry, it will eventually become technologically and economically weak, and it will be conquered by a neighbor who didn't ban science.
So authoritarian regimes often attempt a very dangerous balancing act. They allow the rigorous search for objective truth only in specific, tightly controlled technical fields that generate military or economic power like physics, chemistry, or computer science, while brutally suppressing truth in the social, historical, and political spheres.
Nazi Germany is the ultimate tragic example of this tightrope walk.
It is. The Nazis cultivated brilliant chemists, engineers, and rocket scientists. They embraced objective physical truths when it came to building V-2 rockets.
And as history notes, it was ultimately former Nazi rocket science that helped take Americans to the moon. They possessed immense objective power.
But at the exact same time, it was strictly illegal in Germany to question their deranged, completely fictional theories about race, biology, and history.
So they had massive power, but zero wisdom. They were a hyper-advanced, industrialized war machine being steered by a lunatic story.
And this leads to a very sobering conclusion. Human history is not a triumphant, mathematically guaranteed march toward greater wisdom. We are getting more and more powerful, yes. Our physical technologies and our information networks are vast.
But we are not necessarily getting wiser. We are still walking the exact same precarious tightrope our Stone Age ancestors walked, desperately trying to balance finding the truth of the universe with maintaining enough shared fiction to keep society from collapsing into anarchy.
So what does this all mean for us today? We've established that stories are absolutely essential for large-scale cooperation. We literally can't run a civilization without them.
But we've also established that they are fictions, often manipulative lies, that can lead to horrific genocidal outcomes if they aren't questioned.
So what's the solution? Are all politicians just liars? Is every social structure, every law, every human right just a scam? Is there a way out of this trap?
There is, and it's a brilliant structural workaround. You don't have to choose between telling the absolute, unvarnished, objective truth, which might shatter societal cooperation, and telling a deceptive, manipulative lie. There is a third option. You can tell a fictional story while openly, transparently acknowledging that it is a fiction.
Acknowledge fictions, legal fictions. This brings us to the most spectacular comparison in this whole exploration, contrasting two of the most famous, influential documents in human history, the United States Constitution and the Ten Commandments.
It's a masterful comparison because it bypasses theology and focuses purely on the mechanical difference in how these two texts operate as social software. First, we have to acknowledge an uncomfortable historical similarity. Both documents in their original forms endorsed or tolerated slavery.
The U.S. Constitution notoriously included compromises that maintained racial subjugation and counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation.
And the 10th Commandment explicitly forbids coveting your neighbor's property, listing his house, his ox, and his male slave or female slave, implying that owning human beings is an accepted part of the divine social order as long as you don't covet someone else's.
Both documents were used to maintain a specific social order that included profound injustices.
Yeah.
But the mechanism for the future, the ability to evolve, was totally different. And it all comes down to the very first lines. The U.S. Constitution opens with 3 words, "We the people."
We the people. Those might be the most revolutionary words in political history. By starting that way, the authors of the Constitution were fundamentally rejecting Plato's noble lie. They didn't claim an angel handed them the document on a mountaintop.
They didn't claim it was etched in stone by the finger of the universe. They openly admitted, right there in the preamble, that this entire system was a legal fiction created by fallible, flawed human beings in a room in Philadelphia in order to form a more perfect union.
Because it openly admitted it was human-made, it contained a structural hack. It contained Article V.
The amendment mechanism.
Yeah.
Article V explicitly details the legal process for how the people can change the rules of the game. If humans wrote the code, humans can issue a patch.
And this is exactly what allowed the system, after a massive, bloody civil war, to pass the 13th Amendment and legally abolish slavery. It allowed the intersubjective reality to evolve and correct its own moral failings.
Now contrast that mechanical structure with the Ten Commandments. It doesn't start with "we the people" at the desert. It starts with...
It claims ultimate, superhuman, divine authority. It insists that its intersubjective rules are actually objective, eternal truths of the universe, no different from gravity. And the mechanical consequence of that claim is that there is no amendment process.
There is no 11th commandment that says, if human morality evolves over the next 3,000 years, you can update these rules with a 2/3 majority vote of the congregation.
Because God doesn't need a software update. The consequence is that, structurally, because of this claim of divine origin, the biblical text, as originally written, still technically endorses slavery today. You can reinterpret it, you can preach around it, but you cannot legally edit the source code.
And this exposes the ultimate modern dilemma, the perennial tension of human governance. Admitting that your social order is a human-made fiction makes it incredibly flexible, it makes it amendable, it allows you to fix historical injustices without having to destroy the entire system and start from scratch. But it also comes at a steep, dangerous price.
Because if we openly admit we just made it all up, why should anyone obey it?
Exactly. Acknowledging the human origins of the rules makes them infinitely harder to enforce. If a law is just something a bunch of corrupt, flawed politicians agreed on in a back room, people are going to argue about it endlessly. They will protest it, they will defy it.
That is why, historically, almost every major empire, Russian czars, Muslim caliphs, Chinese emperors, European kings, all claimed divine right. the mandate of heaven. Before the era of mass communication and democratic institutions, you couldn't hold a national debate. It would tear the empire apart.
The only way to stop the arguing and maintain enough order to survive was to claim the rules came from the sky and were absolutely not open to discussion.
And this brings us right to the bleeding edge of the 21st century. Even today, authoritarian regimes still claim unquestionable superhuman authority, whether as divine will or the infallible march of historical destiny, and they crush debate to maintain order. But we also have to look at the other side of the spectrum, aiming right at Silicon Valley.
Yes, the critique of the modern tech giants is incredibly sharp here. Companies like Google, Facebook, X, they operate on a foundational, almost religious mission statement that assumes more information delivered faster to more people will automatically make the world a better, more truthful, more democratic place.
They're completely stuck in the naive view diagram. They genuinely believe information just leads straight to truth and wisdom. They built algorithms to maximize engagement and information flow, assuming truth would naturally rise to the top.
They entirely miss the historical reality of the second diagram. Increasing the speed and volume of information doesn't magically create a utopia, it just accelerates the ancient, dangerous tightrope walk.
Yes, the internet pumps out more truth than ever before.
But it also pumps out massive industrialized amounts of fiction, propaganda, deepfakes, and order-building myths. And it forces us, as individuals and as a society, to balance truth and order at breakneck speeds. The invention of the fictional story taught us this lesson 70,000 years ago. What we are experiencing today on social media is just the hyper-accelerated digital echo of that prehistoric cognitive leap.
Wow. As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's just take a breath and look at the grand journey we've been on today. We started with the biological limits of chimpanzees, unable to break past 150 friends because they ran out of time to groom each other.
We explored how a genetic mutation gave us the ultimate cheat code, the ability to invent and collectively believe in fictions.
We saw how those fictions operate in the real world, turning ordinary colored sugar water into a global symbol of youth, and turning a wounded pigeon into an unquestionable war hero, to the point where actual soldiers altered their own lived memories to fit the cultural narrative.
We looked at the mechanics of forging massive, global families out of thin air, from the expanding story of early Christianity to the ancient memory hacking technology of the Passover Seder. We realize that the money in our pockets, the borders on our maps, and the laws we obey are just intersubjective ghosts, dependent entirely on our collective daily belief.
And we confronted the brutal historical reality that our survival often depends on prioritizing social order over objective truth, a terrible vulnerability that led to the horrors of Nazism, but also a flexibility that allows us to negotiate peace instead of endlessly fighting over material resources like chimpanzees.
Finally, we learned the crucial mechanical difference between a commandment that demands blind, eternal obedience and a constitution that admits its own flaws and allows us to patch the code to build a better future.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've spent this time looking at how massive networks, nations, religions, empires use noble lies and powerful brands to maintain order on a macro level. But what about at the micro level? Think about your own life.
Think about your workplace, your family dynamics, or even your carefully curated social media persona.
What are the intersubjective realities or the personal brands you have created for yourself to maintain order in your own social circle? What fictions do you tell yourself to get through the day? And more importantly, ask yourself, are you treating your own personal fictions as immutable commandments that can never be questioned or changed?
Or do you treat your identity like a constitution flawed, human-made, and always open to amendment?
That is a brilliant question to end on, because as we've learned today, the most powerful forces in your world aren't the things you can touch. They're the invisible stories you choose to tell.
And if you have the power to tell a story, you have the power to rewrite it. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey today. Keep questioning the stories that shape your world. We'll catch you next time.